Fine powdery limestone dust coats the sweating shoulders of Thutmose. The royal chief of works stands in the blistering heat of his studio, a suffocating oven surrounded by barren desert. His bronze chisel bites into the raw stone with heavy, rhythmic precision. He is shaping the sharp, alien geometry of a flat-topped blue helmet, a crown never before worn by a woman. Modern minds remember Queen Nefertiti as a mere standard of ancient elegance, a passive beauty locked in a delicate painted bust. This is a profound lie. To Thutmose and the exhausted laborers of the 14th century BCE, she was no fragile consort. She was a ruthless political architect and the co-author of a massive religious upheaval. The Egyptian empire is at the absolute zenith of its staggering power. Its economic reach stretches from the gold-rich veins of Nubia to the fertile banks of the Euphrates. Yet Pharaoh Akhetaten and Nefertiti have chosen to dismantle this ancient foundation. They outlawed the thousand-year-old pantheon of gods. They stripped the omnipotent priests of Amun of their unimaginable wealth. Instead, they declared absolute devotion to a single, faceless entity known as the Aten, the solar disk. How long can a civilization survive when its rulers declare war on heaven itself? To cement this massive heresy, the royal couple dragged tens of thousands of subjects into a desolate, scorched basin in Middle Egypt. They are building a utopian city from scratch. They call this new capital Akhetaten, where the sun does not just warm the earth, but actively punishes it. Thutmose wipes the gritty silica dust from his stinging eyes. He listens to the distant groans of laborers hauling massive stones under a relentless, blinding sky. For the master sculptor, this daily struggle is not merely artistic. It is a desperate test of raw human endurance. He must forge the visual propaganda of an entirely new world order. His copper chisels must translate divine rebellion into eternal stone. He must carve the illusion of invincibility for a highly vulnerable regime. If he fails, the enraged priests of the old gods will tear this desert utopia apart. The political tension in the air is suffocating. Thutmose strikes the limestone once more. He carefully carves the severe, commanding jawline of his terrifying queen. He knows that every strike of his wooden mallet is an act of high treason against the old establishment. The blistering sands outside his workshop are shifting. The exiled priests of Amun are waiting in the dark shadows of Thebes, watching the new capital closely. Stepping out of his sweltering studio, Thutmose surveys the blinding white quarries of the Amarna basin. Building a sprawling metropolis in the dead center of an uninhabitable desert requires more than divine inspiration. It demands a logistical miracle. To erect the city at impossible speeds, the royal regime invented a revolutionary architectural weapon. They call it the talatat block. These standardized limestone bricks measure precisely 54 by 27 by 27 centimeters. That is exactly one ancient Egyptian cubit long and half a cubit wide. It is a masterpiece of dark efficiency. The blocks are uniform, easily measured, and quickly cut. But their precise size is no accident. A single talatat block is just small enough to be carried by one exhausted laborer. This ruthless innovation completely eliminates the need for massive ramps and synchronized hauling teams. Thutmose oversees the carving of thousands of these pristine stones every single day. He watches a relentless, sweating river of men carrying the literal weight of a royal fever dream. What was the true cost of this rapid utopia? The answer lies buried in the unmarked sand of the outer districts. Modern bioarchaeology has finally ripped the romantic veil off this golden era. In 2025, comprehensive studies of the commoner cemeteries unearthed a staggering reality. The holy city was no sunlit paradise. The laborers tasked with dragging heaven down to earth were systematically exhausted by the state they served. Unearthed skeletons reveal severe nutritional deficiencies, rampant scurvy, and catastrophic spinal trauma. The relentless daily hauling of heavy stones severely damaged their vertebrae. Their average physical height plummeted. Even the youngest children bore deep horizontal grooves of systemic malnutrition, permanently etched into their developing teeth. Older historians once guessed that a sudden sweeping plague eventually emptied this utopian megacity. They were entirely wrong. There was no sudden tragedy. There was only the grinding, calculated deprivation of a captive populace. They were forced to endure extreme hardship for a paradise they were never allowed to enjoy. The workforce was simply pushed until their bodies gave out. Thutmose listens to the sharp, endless crack of wooden mallets against hard stone echoing across the basin. The great temples of the Akhetaten are rising at a terrifying, unnatural pace. Their pristine white walls reflect the blinding glory of the new sun god. But the master sculptor knows the brutal truth hiding beneath the smooth plaster. The foundations of eternity are secured by the broken bodies of the poor. As the grand monuments climb higher into the blistering sky, the cracks in the royal foundation begin to show. How long can this isolated utopia ignore the suffering outside its temple walls? Inside the royal workshop, the suffocating heat of the midday sun beats down through narrow windows. Thutmose stands before a fresh limestone block. His bronze chisel rests against its powdery white surface. He is not merely carving stone today, he is carving pure treason. He has been ordered to shatter the ancient bedrock of cosmic balance. He is executing a scene strictly reserved for the ruling monarch alone. His chisel bites into the rock, tracing aggressive fluid lines. He shapes the unmistakable figure of Queen Nefertiti standing upon a royal barge. She is not depicted as a silent wife handing her husband a lotus flower. Her arm is raised high in the air. Her hand grips a heavy bronze sickle sword. Her other hand is firmly tangled in the hair of a foreign captive. By carving this martial dominance, Thutmose is documenting a terrifying shift in the hierarchy of the known world. Nefertiti is being visually engineered as the physical equal of the pharaoh. She drives her own war chariot. She conducts the most sacred religious rituals. She personally strikes down the enemies of the state. To the exiled priests of Amun, this iconography is a grotesque abomination. But the heresy of this new capital does not stop at military propaganda. It warps the human form itself. Thutmose taps his heavy wooden mallet, smoothing the bizarre, elongated skull of the queen. The traditional, mathematically perfect proportions of Egyptian art have been deliberately mutated. The royal family is now depicted with spindly limbs, swelling thighs, and heavy bellies. It is a highly calculated alien aesthetic. Why distort the most powerful people on Earth? The regime demands they be shown as androgynous vessels. They must embody both male and female principles of creation. They are no longer merely human. They are the living avatars of the solar disk. The master sculptor blows the fine silica dust from the block. He carefully carves the sweeping geometric rays of the Akhetaten reaching from the sky. At the end of each ray, a tiny human hand extends toward the royal couple. The hands clutch the sacred breath of life, pressing it directly to the nostrils of Nefertiti. The sun feeds her alone. Thutmose runs his calloused thumb over the finished limestone. He feels the immense political weight of his creation. He is the chief propagandist of a highly dangerous regime. He is actively elevating a queen to a living god. The priests of the old world are watching from the shadows, sharpening their bronze knives. As the commanding image of her power takes shape in the white stone, a chilling question lingers in the silent workshop. What happens when a mortal woman flies too close to the sun? The suffocating heat of year 12 radiates off the blinding white plaster of the great palace. Thutmose stands in the narrow shadows to watch a massive festival of foreign tribute. Envoys from the Levant, Nubia, and the Hittite Empire crawl through the hot dust. They drag heavy sacks of gold and exotic beasts toward the royal baldachin. Akhetaten and Nefertiti sit beneath the towering sunshade like untouchable deities.
It is a flawless theater of absolute power. But is the Egyptian empire truly secure? Behind the glittering facade of raw gold, the utopian dream is quietly rotting. The geopolitical map is rapidly collapsing. Far to the north, the ruthless Hittite war machine is swallowing Egyptian vassal states whole.
Desperate clay tablets arrive daily from loyal kings in Syria, begging for chariots and archers to hold the line. The pharaoh ignores these frantic pleas. He refuses to send a single bronze blade to defend the northern borders. Akhetaten is entirely consumed by his religious obsession, letting the empire fracture while he worships the light. The protective rays of the Aten are failing to shield the realm. Then, the shadow of mortality breaches the high palace walls. The sun god demands a sacrifice no parent can bear. Princess Akhetaten, the second eldest royal daughter, suddenly perishes. The golden bubble of divine invulnerability shatters in an instant. Thutmose is dragged from his bright studio to the dark, suffocating depths of the royal tomb carved deep into the eastern cliffs. He is not brought here to carve another scene of military triumph. He is ordered to document an unprecedented tragedy. The master sculptor grips his copper chisel with trembling hands. His wooden mallet strikes the cold limestone, shaping a scene that defies every rule of Egyptian artistic tradition. He carves the raw, ugly reality of human grief. He depicts the monarch and his fierce queen weeping openly over the lifeless body of their child. Their divine posture is completely broken. Their sculpted hands reach out in desperate, agonizing sorrow. By carving this extreme vulnerability into eternal stone, Thutmose realizes a terrifying truth. The living gods of Amarna are fragile. News of the royal tragedy quickly seeps into the outer districts. Down in the sprawling, sun-baked grid of the laborers' quarters, the starving commoners begin to whisper. They chew on gritty bread and nurse their shattered spines, muttering that the ancient gods have finally awakened. The disgraced pantheon of Thebes is exacting a brutal, calculated revenge. The utopian city is cursed. Hundreds of miles away, the exiled priests of Amun listen to the shifting desert winds. They sense the deep weakness radiating from the heretic capital. The tension inside the bright walls of Akhetaten rapidly escalates from a radical religious experiment to a dark, paranoid siege mentality. The royal family isolates themselves behind heavy wooden doors. The grand avenues grow quiet and empty. The fierce reign of the solar disk is entering its final, desperate twilight. Following the suffocating spectacle of year 12, the most powerful woman in the ancient world simply vanishes. Official orders mentioning the great royal wife abruptly cease. Her fierce face is no longer commissioned for the massive boundary monuments. For decades, modern historians assumed she had quietly fallen out of favor. They guessed she died of a sudden illness or was banished. But the logistical reality of the Egyptian court does not allow for a silent disappearance. Thutmose is given a new, highly classified directive. He is no longer ordered to carve the likeness of his queen. Instead, he must prepare divine iconography for a phantom figure. A new co-regent has suddenly emerged from the shadows to share the fractured throne with the failing Akhetaten. His name is Smenkhkare. The transition of power is swift, quiet, and heavily guarded. Thutmose stands in his sweltering studio, wiping the stinging grit from his eyes. The master sculptor receives the royal measurements for the new male pharaoh. He prepares his sharpest copper chisels to shape the image of the newest sovereign. But the numbers dictated by the scribes do not make sense. How can a fully grown man possess such delicate, familiar geometry? Thutmose measures the block of limestone, feeling the suffocating weight of an impossible secret. What happens when a dying dynasty is backed into a corner? They lie. The ultimate proof of this massive deception remained buried for millennia. Deep in a remote limestone quarry at Deir el-Bersha,
A startling modern discovery completely rewrote the timeline of the Amarna era. 12 years ago, researchers deciphered a crude inscription written in red ochre. It is explicitly dated to year 16, day 15 of the third month of Akhet. The text clearly mentions Nefertiti as the living great royal wife. She did not die in year 12. She was alive, plotting in the dark, watching the old world sharpen its bronze knives. Thutmose stands alone before his pristine block of white stone. He holds the physical measurements of the new king Smenkhkare in his calloused hands. The terrifying truth of his new royal commission washes over him. The Sun Queen has not vanished into the burning desert. She has merely shed her skin. To save her crumbling family from the wrath of the old gods, she is executing a highly dangerous political maneuver. She is erasing her female identity to rule as a male god-king. Thutmose stares at the blank limestone, his heavy wooden mallet trembling. He must carve a physical lie so perfect that it holds a fractured world together. If the enraged priests of Amun discover this ultimate heresy, they will not just destroy her, they will erase her very soul. The avatar of the sun is now playing a deadly, silent game in the shadows. The bronze chisel bites fiercely into the raw limestone. Thutmose stands in the suffocating heat of his desert workshop, his calloused hands slick with sweat. He is executing the royal decrees for the newest sovereign of Egypt, Smenkhkare. He carves the rigid, absolute trappings of a traditional male king. He shapes the ceremonial false beard and angles the heavy pharaonic headdress. He cuts the broad, commanding shoulders required to project divine authority. But as he smooths the jawline and measures the facial geometry, a terrifying familiarity stops his heavy wooden mallet in midair. He has carved these exact proportions 1,000 times before. The delicate sweeping curve of the neck, the impossibly sharp cheekbones, the highly specific, weighted volume of the lips does not belong to a young male heir. They belong to Nefertiti. The queen has not perished in the shadows. She is executing the ultimate, desperate illusion. To stabilize a rapidly collapsing empire and shield her dying husband, she has completely shed her female identity. She is taking on the titulary of a male pharaoh. Ancient Egyptian law dictates that the cosmos can only be held together by the divine masculine form. A queen cannot command the turning of the universe. A king must.
Thutmose is now directly complicit in the grandest deception of the ancient world. How do you hide a goddess in plain sight? You carve the lie into eternal stone. The master sculptor meticulously translates a woman into the armored, masculine silhouette demanded by the state. Yet beneath the rigid lines of the false beard, he leaves the subtle, lingering grace of the Sun Queen. She is attempting an impossible diplomatic tightrope walk to buy her dynasty precious time. She must bridge the terrifying gap between the radical solar heresy of her husband and the encroaching fury of the old world. Thutmose wipes a thick layer of powdery white dust from the unblinking eyes of the newly carved king. The physical toll of this secret is crushing. His lungs rattle with inhaled silica. Every strike of his copper chisel feels like a countdown to their mutual destruction. The outer city is starving, and the northern borders are burning. King Smenkhkare is the last desperate shield against total annihilation. But a disguise of cold stone and plaster cannot stop the inevitable collapse. Down in the dark temples of Thebes, the exiled priests of Amun are not easily fooled. They know exactly who hides behind the ceremonial false beard. The avatar of the sun is trapped. She is now playing a highly dangerous game of survival in the dark. The shadows are closing in. The inevitable strike of mortality shatters the desert utopia. Akhetaten, the visionary who declared war on the heavens, is dead. The grand avenues of Akhetaten fall completely silent. Nefertiti now rules entirely alone under the armored guise of the male pharaoh Smenkhkare. She must hold back the crushing weight of a collapsing empire. The heavy air is stagnant and suffocating. The physical reality of this era is rapidly disintegrating. Massive state granaries are scraped down to bare stone. Exhausted laborers quietly abandon the blinding limestone quarries, slipping away into the dark desert night. Far to the north, desperate military commanders demand immediate reinforcements. Their clay tablets detail the catastrophic collapse of the borders. The Akhetaten cannot feed a starving army. How long can a phantom king rule a ghost town? Inside the royal workshop, the atmosphere shifts to absolute desperation. Thutmose is no longer carving colossal monuments to a glorious future. His calloused hands now churn out panicked funerary goods. He carves protective figures with frantic strikes of his wooden mallet. He is trying to legitimize a crumbling regime. The sharp scent of cedar wood and the metallic tang of copper dust fill the stifling air. Thutmose works until his hands are raw. Nefertiti realizes that religious fanaticism alone cannot save her doomed dynasty. In a final bid for survival, the disguised Sun Queen prepares the ultimate compromise. She dispatches elite envoys back to the dark temples of Thebes. She is attempting to appease the very priests her husband tried to destroy. Thutmose pauses his heavy mallet. He watches the royal couriers ride out through the massive boundary markers, carrying the fragile weight of survival into the shifting dunes. The master sculptor turns back to the shadows of his quiet studio. He looks upon his greatest creation. It is a flawless, painted limestone bust of the queen. Her flat-topped blue crown is perfectly rendered, blazing with brilliant crushed lapis and red ochre. The smooth curve of her neck defies the harsh geometry of the heretic art style. It is the face of a woman who commanded the earth. But the masterpiece is incomplete. Her left eye is a hollow socket, waiting for a final piece of polished rock crystal. Thutmose holds the gleaming quartz inlay in his tired palm. He looks at the blind eye of the goddess. He slowly lowers his hand, leaving the eye eternally unfinished. A cold dread settles over his aching bones. He senses that the grand era of the solar disk is drawing its final breath. The most beautiful face he has ever immortalized is about to be hunted down. The merciless architects of the old world are coming to reclaim their stolen power. The end of the Amarna era does not arrive with the clash of bronze swords on a chaotic battlefield. It arrives with a silent, suffocating political collapse. Smenkhkare, the disguised queen, simply vanishes from the fractured timeline. Whether by sudden illness or complete physical exhaustion, her desperate reign ends. The absolute silence in the great palace is heavier than stone. Into this terrifying vacuum steps a fragile boy. Akhetaten inherits the crumbling throne of a broken world. But he is no living god. He is a highly vulnerable pawn. The exiled priests of Amun, backed by ruthless military might, launch their counteroffensive. They do not demand a polite return to the old ways. They demand the total erasure of the solar heresy. The decree echoes from the dark temples of Thebes with absolute finality. Akhetaten is to be permanently abandoned. The sunlit Utopia is condemned to rot. Down in the sprawling grid of the outer districts, the terrifying logistics of mass exodus begin. Tens of thousands of starving, broken laborers scramble to pack their meager lives. The immense wealth of the royal city is hastily stripped from the grand temples. Teams of exhausted men load heavy wooden barges with gold statues and sacred vessels. Panic chokes the dusty streets as families fight for space on the departing riverboats. The once glorious capital is violently hollowed out. Thutmose stands frozen in the center of his stifling workshop. The frantic sounds of the evacuation echo through his high windows. He must make a devastating logistical choice. He frantically shoves his essential copper tools, his rare mineral pigments, and his small reference models into woven reed bags. His calloused hands shake. The survival of his craft depends entirely on what he can carry across the burning desert. But what about the gods he carved? He looks around the crowded, dust-filled studio at his monumental life work. The colossal stone faces of the royal family stare blindly back at him. They are far too heavy to drag through the deep sand. Worse, they are now incredibly dangerous to possess. Carrying the face of the fallen queen into a world that violently despises her is a guaranteed execution. The new regime will show no mercy to the chief propagandist of the old order. Thutmose slowly approaches his ultimate masterpiece, the painted limestone bust of Nefertiti. He traces the brilliant blue crown one last time, feeling the smooth plaster beneath his fingertips. He lifts the heavy, perfectly balanced stone. He gently places the beautiful, incomplete face of the queen onto a simple mud brick shelf. Slowly, he turns her commanding gaze toward the blank wall. Thutmose walks out into the punishing glare of the sun. He joins the endless river of defeated exiles marching toward the Nile. The harsh desert winds begin to howl through the empty avenues of the abandoned Utopia. The golden horizon of the Akhetaten is finally swallowed by the sand. The dust of the frantic evacuation barely settles before the architects of vengeance arrive. The priests of Amun, backed by the ruthless general Horemheb, do not just reclaim the fractured throne. They unleash a weapon far deadlier than bronze swords. It is the systematic, absolute erasure of a human soul from eternity. They execute a cold, calculated dismantling of the empty city. The grand avenues of Akhetaten swarm with the very men who built them. The starving laborers with their shattered spines are marched right back into the blistering heat. But this time, they are ordered to destroy. The thousands of pristine limestone blocks that Thutmose painstakingly carved are ripped from the plaster walls. The treasonous scenes of Nefertiti smiting foreign enemies come crashing down. How do you kill a living god? You bury them in the dark. The dismantled blocks of the heretic Utopia are not ground into useless powder. They are loaded onto massive wooden barges and dragged miles upriver toward Karnak. Thutmose's rebellious carvings arrive directly in the beating heart of the old world. The furious priests of Amun do not shatter the artwork. They enact a far more calculated, vicious revenge. In a cruel twist of architectural spite, the beautiful stones are completely stripped of their divine status. They are tossed into the hollow core of massive new stone pylons. The priests use the sacred limestone as cheap, hidden rubble. The blasphemous faces of Akhetaten and his fierce sun queen are shoved deep into the suffocating foundations of Amun. They are sealed away forever behind thousands of tons of heavy, crushing masonry. The light of the Akhetaten is permanently plunged into absolute darkness. The meticulous art that Thutmose forged to last an eternity is locked in a pitch-black tomb. The immediate historical consequence is breathtaking in its terrifying efficiency. Nefertiti's royal cartouche is violently hacked from the sacred king lists with heavy copper chisels. The sprawling metropolis of Akhetaten is scrubbed entirely from the official maps. The entire 17-year revolution is surgically excised from the timeline of the Egyptian empire. To the new scribes, the blinding heresy simply never happened. The ultimate cost of their radical religious experiment is the complete annihilation of their identity. Ancient Egyptian law is terrifyingly clear. Without a name carved in eternal stone, a human soul ceases to exist in the afterlife. The priests of Thebes officially declare that the heretics were never born. They turn the most powerful woman of the ancient world into a nameless, wandering ghost. Back in the abandoned desert basin, the shifting sands slowly bury the forgotten workshop. The blank wall hides the unfinished face of a queen erased from time. The absolute vengeance of the old gods is finally complete.
The shadow of the ancient world stretches across the dunes, swallowing the last traces of the sun. For over 3 millennia, the silent desert reclaims Amarna. The punishing sands bury the mud brick palaces, grinding the utopian dream back into raw earth. Thutmose's stifling workshop is swallowed whole by the shifting dunes. His abandoned masterpieces sleep in the suffocating dark, isolated from the turning world above. The vengeance of the old gods appears absolute, yet the ruthless efficiency of the priests birthed a chilling historical paradox. How do you accidentally grant eternal life to the very ghost you are trying to execute? You entomb her in the dark. By burying thousands of talatat blocks deep inside the airtight pylons of Karnak, the architects of vengeance created a perfect, unintended time capsule. The crushing stone sealed the blasphemous carvings away from the ravages of erosion and greedy grave robbers. When modern archaeologists finally cracked open the massive pylons in the 20th century, they were met with a staggering sight. They found the treasonous smiting scenes of Nefertiti flawlessly preserved. The desperate attempt to obliterate her became the exact mechanical cause of her survival. 114 years ago, a German excavation crew dug heavily through the shifting dunes of Middle Egypt. Their iron shovels suddenly hit the crumbling ruins of Thutmose's forgotten studio. There, resting exactly on the simple mud brick shelf where the master sculptor had abandoned it, sat the painted limestone bust of the Sun Queen. Her flat-topped blue crown still blazed with the original brilliant crushed lapis and red ochre pigments. The colors were impossibly vibrant. Her unbroken single eye stared blindly into the future. The ultimate masterpiece had simply waited in the suffocating dark for humanity to finally remember her name. But the echo of her violent past remains terrifyingly unresolved. Modern science has unearthed her ruined city and exposed her hidden phantom reign as a male king. Yet, despite decades of obsessive ground-penetrating radar and advanced DNA testing, the physical body of Nefertiti has never been conclusively identified. The royal tombs of Amarna lay ransacked and empty. The hidden mummy caches of Thebes hold no absolute proof of her royal flesh. She remains the ultimate obsession of modern Egyptology, a phantom king who vanished into the blowing sand.
Furious priests of Amun tried to crush her divine soul beneath thousands of tons of heavy masonry. They failed to erase her face. The physical avatar of the solar disk is still out there. She is hiding somewhere in the endless dark, refusing to be found.